Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Dark and Quiet Skies for Science and Society workshop. My name is Connie Walker. I'm glad you could join us. I'm the co-chair of the Dark and Quiet Skies workshop along with Simonetta Di Bippo. Today, the workshop is focusing on the impact of artificial light at night on the bioenvironment. The goals of this session are to examine the current understanding of the effects of artificial light at night on human health and on flora and fauna, to propose recommended guidelines for regulations as well as the targets for reduction, and to coordinate with stakeholders. To help us achieve these goals, there are a number of experts who worked for several weeks in these areas. They will be reporting out today. The overarching institutions involved in organizing this workshop are the International Astronomical Union, the United Nations through the Office of Outer Space Affairs, and the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias, with additional support from NSF's National Optical Infrared Astronomy Research Laboratory, or NOIR Lab. It is my sincere pleasure now to introduce to you the Director of NOIR Lab, Pat McCarthy. Pat?
Thank you, Connie. Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, as befits your particular longitude. As Connie says, my name is Patrick McCarthy, and I'm the director of the National Science Foundation's National Optical Infrared Astronomy Research Laboratory. That's quite a name. We operate nighttime observatories in 3 geographic locations: in the southwestern United States, in the Chilean Andes, and in the island of Hawaii. These are among the premier sites for ground-based optical astronomy. They're really some of the best places left on the Earth to view the night sky. Unfortunately, they are under increasing threat from light pollution. Particular modern technology, low-cost LED lighting, the proliferation of the large number of low Earth orbiting satellites have the potential to dramatically impact our ability to study the heavens from the surface of the Earth. The night sky belongs to all of us, not just to the astronomers, and of course not just to Homo sapiens, but to all of us that live on the planet. That ranges from the majestic migratory birds that use a distribution of stars, you might think of those as the constellations, to navigate as they span the globe in their annual migrations from one hemisphere to another, all the way down to the earthbound dung beetle that aligns its body with the unresolved light of millions of stars that we call the Milky Way, something that's hard to see from many of the cities on the Earth now. Early humans used the stars to navigate as they traversed the open oceans, the stars being their only fixed reference points, and that allowed early humans to reach areas that were beyond reach before a proper understanding of stellar navigation. Astronomers, of course, we use the night sky to study the universe, to search out the origin of life in the universe, explore habitable worlds, and understand the composition of dark matter, dark energy, and the evolution of the cosmos. The simple observation that the night sky is dark actually has profound implications for our understanding of the universe. Unfortunately, today, many of us, that's plants, animals, and people alike, are experiencing adverse impacts to our lives, to our health, from the loss of darkness at night. So we may not be able to turn back the clock and restore the dark skies to the cities and to the suburbs, but we can protect the dark skies that we have. This will take a concerted global effort, just as being done here today. I'd like to thank the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs and its director, Dr. Di Bippo, the International Astronomical Union and its president, Dr. Van Dishoek, and particularly the staff of the Institute of the Astrophysics Institute of the Canary Islands for hosting this really important meeting, and its director, Dr. Rabolo. If we're going to make progress in this noble effort, we need to work together globally. We need to develop plans to act locally to address the issues. So I thank you all for taking the time this week to explore this particularly interesting challenge, and for all of us to work together to protect the dark skies, not just for us and for our descendants, but for all the inhabitants of the Earth. With that, I'm happy to turn the proceedings over now to Professor Lowenthal. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you for your support of this conference and its important work. Good morning, everybody. I'm James Lowenthal at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts in the United States. I am a member of the Scientific Organizing Committee of Dark and Quiet Skies, and I'm the moderator of today's session on the bioenvironment. First, a couple of simple bookkeeping announcements. want to remind you that today is one of 5 sessions, one per day this whole week. Each session corresponds to one of the 5 area topic area draft reports. All 5 of the reports are available for you to download and comment on. The link is here for where to download them from, and also the link for where to put your comments. And we welcome your comments. The current drafts will be revised before being finalized and then merged into a single report to be delivered to the United Nations. If you registered for today's workshop, you should have all this information in your inbox already. And then a little bit of housekeeping for today. If you have a question, and if yesterday was any indication, you will have a question or a comment or an answer to a question, please make liberal use of the chat. Try to keep it short because, as you can see from yesterday, a lot of people have a lot to say, and we think we probably have more people online today than we did yesterday. I can't see the number right now, but keep those questions short if you can, the comments. And when we turn to the Q&A after the presentations today, the 4 presentations, please put only questions in the chat, not comments and answers, just questions to help us facilitate and manage the passing of those questions to the panelists. Thank you. Participants will be unmuted, participants who are not panelists will remain muted. Only the panelists, the members of the SOC and the working group will be unmuted. At the end, as I say, of the 4 presentations, we'll turn to Q&A. I'd like to introduce briefly the 10 members of our working group. After myself, our co-chair, Kostas Barousis from Greece, Salvador Barra from Spain, Annika Jägerbrandt from Sweden, Andreas Jakob from Germany, Travis Longcore from the United States, Mario Mota from the United States, Pedro Sanhuesa from Chile, Luc Schlangen from the Netherlands, and Sibylle Schroer also from Germany. And now just a little bit more on what our working group did. Our charge was to examine the existing literature, and there are volumes and volumes of it, on the effects of artificial light at night, or ALAN, on human health. And we have some of the world's experts advising us and members of our working group on this issue. We also have some of the world's experts reviewing the existing literature, many of them have contributed to it, on the effects of artificial light at night on plants and animals. And our job was to compile what we thought was the latest scientific consensus on these issues and to propose recommended guidelines for the regulation of artificial light at night, with an eye just towards protecting the bioenvironment, including humans, not considering necessarily astronomy. For example, astronomers don't want the lights to go up into the sky. Animals and plants don't want the light to go down toward the earth. So how do we balance these things? Our job was really look at the biological implications and then coordinate later with other working groups, but first focus on our specific topic. And we also need to coordinate with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, which is conducting a sort of parallel effort. Now a little bit more about our 4 presenters today, whom I'll introduce one all at once right now and then turn it over to Luc. Dr. Luc Schlangen is senior researcher in the Intelligent Lighting Institute in the Department of Human Technology Interaction at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. He holds a PhD degree from Wageningen University. His main interests are circadian system, human photoreception, and the visual and non-visual responses to light and lighting in lab and field settings. Luc is a board member of the International Commission on Illumination, the CIE, which is playing a big role in the organization of this meeting, and serves as director of CIE Division 6, Photobiology and Photochemistry. He has chaired the CIE committee that prepared international standards with new metrics to quantify light for its non-visual responses, which we'll hear more about shortly. Our second presenter, Dr. Mario Mota, is a full-time cardiologist in the Partners Healthcare System in Salem, Massachusetts, United States, and an associate clinical professor of medicine at Tufts Medical School in Boston. He's been involved in many healthcare issues as a trustee of the American Medical Association. He was the principal author of the 3 AMA reports on healthcare effects of ALAN when he was on the AMA Council of Science and Public Health. He's also a past president of the Massachusetts Medical Society and the American Association of Variable Star Observers, and has previously been on the board of the International Dark Sky Association. Our third presenter, Dr. Sibylle Schröer, has for 10 years been scientific coordinator of the Working Group on Light Pollution and Ecophysiology at the Leibniz Institute of Freshwater Ecology and Inland Fisheries in Berlin, Germany. She coordinated the EU Cost Action Loss of the Night Network, LONNE, from 2012 to 2016, a cooperation of stakeholders to improve knowledge about the multiple effects of increasing artificial illumination worldwide. Dr. Schröer has experience in insect management and protection strategies. She holds a PhD in agricultural science and has worked on projects at the German Federal Research Center for Cultivated Plants at the University of Florida in the US and the Christian Albrecht University in Kiel, Germany. Finally, Dr. Annika Jägerbrand is assistant professor in environmental science at Halmstad University, Sweden. She conducts research about outdoor lighting, light pollution, lighting design, sustainability, and traffic safety of outdoor lighting, especially the ecological impacts of LEDs and measures to mitigate those ecological impacts. She has a PhD in ecology and is project leader, consultant, and research manager in multiple interdisciplinary projects. She is the chair of the new CIE Technical Committee on Artificial Lighting and its impact on the natural environment. And now I will turn the mic over to Dr. Luc Schlangen, who will speak on the effect of light on circadian rhythms and melatonin.
Hello, everyone. Just raising my voice. I'm not sure whether I can start speaking. Okay, thanks, James. Thank you all for joining this set of lectures and this afternoon's meeting. It's a pleasure for me to be able to participate and contribute to the event. And I'd like to start with my presentation. And no need to further introduce me since James has already done this. Circadian rhythms are strongly determining the 24-hour physiology and behavior, and they're very apparent in our 24-hour physiology and behavior. On this slide, you see an example of how the melatonin hormone varies across 24 hours in our body. The same for body temperature, which drops at night and has its highest value across daytime if you would not be eating or moving around. So it's a very small amplitude, but you can measure it in laboratory circumstances. Cortisol typically peaks about in the morning to allow to get ready for action and wake up. You see our behavior also varies in terms of performance, alertness, motivation. They are all lowest at night, and during daytime they are highest. And that is indeed the case for a diurnal species like man is active. Next click, please. These circadian rhythms, they are strongly regulated by light, and light does regulate these rhythms much more powerfully than any drug can. But there are also other actions that can act as an entrainment, as sidecamber for circadian rhythms. Food intake can, temperature can, physical activity can, even sound of relatives is known to be inducing some entrainment. But all these and other training actions are much weaker as compared to what light can do, and how strongly light is entraining for circadian rhythms and the sleep-wake cycle. Next slide, please. Melatonin is a strong marker of our circadian rhythm, and it's relevant to know what melatonin is. It's a hormone that we produce naturally, and it peaks during the habitual night. What you see at the bottom figure is in dim night. At the time that we habitually sleep, melatonin starts rising, and then it remains high across the night. And by the time that we habitually wake up, melatonin again drops. And mind, this melatonin oscillation happens in dim light. So even if there is no light around, melatonin will be dropping in the morning by itself at the time that we habitually wake. Melatonin supports nighttime behavior. It's a marker of the night, and this is conserved across all species. That means for a diurnal species like man, melatonin facilitates sleep initiation and sleep consolidation. But for a nocturnal species like many rodents and some insects and other animals, melatonin is more a signal of activity. So it's not melatonin signal is conserved in the night. Also, nocturnal animals produce melatonin at night, and for them, it's a signal of activity. So as I said, melatonin is not detectable or low during daytime, even in darkness, And it's a marker of the body clock. It's the best marker and a commonly used marker of a body clock, and it marks our sleep-wake cycle. Our usual bedtime occurs typically about 2 hours after the melatonin onset in dim light. And you can see in this figure that this individual typically then would go to have a habitual bedtime at about 2 a.m. in the morning. Next click, please. So if there is no light around, then melatonin will run at its own endogenous rhythm that is dictated by the central pacemaker, the master clock, you could say, in the suprachiasmatic nuclei residing in our brain. And if we are entrained to a light-dark cycle, then melatonin is nicely produced only at night in the dark area on the right-hand side, where you see the sleep period, and across it remains stable. If there's light during the day, the sleep period is fixed, and this is called entrained. However, if we would be living in constant darkness, for instance, a miner who has gone underground and can't resurface anymore because of some accidents, then biological rhythms will go free running in this constant darkness. And that means that every day the melatonin secretion will be produced a bit later, and it will run with its endogenous period, which in humans typically is 24.2 hours. And that means that our sleep is moving later and later by about 50 minutes a day. And that means that after 4 days, your sleep will have delayed by 1 hour. After 8 days, it will have been delayed by 2 hours, and so on. And that's what you can see in the sleep running example. Next click, please. Light is regulating the timing and the amount of melatonin secretion. And here you see that evening light, that means that this light that is on the left-hand side of this melatonin peak. If you switch it on, next click, please, then this melatonin peak will move to a later timing, as you can see here. Next click, please. Morning light, which is given in the morning, so after normally when the melatonin levels are starting to fall, and this light in the morning will push the melatonin peak to the left side. Next click, please. As you can see in this graph. And that means that we are now going to bed early, because you can see that the melatonin levels start rising earlier in the evening. And also, it's more easy to rise in the morning because then the melatonin levels are already lower. Next slide, please. Next click. Yeah. Daytime light strengthens melatonin secretion. So here you see the two yellow rectangles. If there is lots of daytime light in people that have little light exposure, that will help to increase their melatonin secretion. Next slide. Next click. Yeah, here you see the increased melatonin secretion due to daytime light levels. Next click. Light during the habitual night will suppress melatonin. And here you see the melatonin peak on the right-hand side. And if we switch on this light, next click, please, then this melatonin level will drop instantaneously. And this response is very rapid. It can occur within about 50 minutes. And typically, if the light is switched off, then the melatonin levels again rebound and go up again. Next click. So light is regulating the sleep-wake cycle, and it adjusts the timing of the sleep-wake cycle. So here you see again the entrained situation on top when there is a light-dark cycle. Then we move to constant darkness. Next click, please. And in this constant darkness, and this goes wrong. In this constant darkness, the clock is free running, and our sleep naturally drifts later. And the second bullet is that if you have light that aligns the body clock in the morning, the morning light is advancing the circadian rhythm, as you can see by the blue text in the middle of the figure. And if you have evening light, which is the blue text on the left of the figure, you see that this evening light is again delaying sleep timing. And it's the coordinated action of both light exposures after sleep periods for morning light and evening light that adjusts the timing of a sleep-wake cycle, so that we become entrained to the 24-hour light-dark cycle that we typically that we have on Earth. So light resets the circadian rhythm from this endogenous period, which is longer than 24 hours, to match exactly this 24-hour. Next click, please. So the human light environment is totally different, or the electrical light environment, I would say, totally differs from the natural light environment. And this is an example where a researcher, Ken Wright from the University of Colorado, has been done a camping study with a group of people that went out camping, only had access to electrical light and candles. and sorry, only has access to natural light and fire and candles, but no electrical light. And here you see the light exposure that people have when they live in under natural light only, which is a dark curve, and mine's the logarithmic axis on the y-axis here. And if they live in urban environments with electrical light, you see that they have much reduced light exposure in daytime, and there is much more light in the evening. Next clip, please. And these electrical light conditions that man typically lives in drives strongly to create more eveningness. So it makes us more an evening person. Next clip, please. And part of this is due to the fact that the light exposure that we have in our indoor, mainly indoor living environment, differs so largely from a natural light environment. And the first striking difference is that we have in our indoor environment much less morning light. And that means, as I've explained before, that we have a less early sleep-wake cycle, so that our sleep tends to drift later. Next clip, please. Secondly, we have much more evening light, and that means that we have strong melatonin suppression in the evening, which you can see in the left panel in the middle. And also, since we have more evening light, the melatonin peak will be more delayed and will enforce a later sleep-wake cycle, which you can see in the bottom right panel in the middle. Next clip, please. And then the third striking difference is that there's much less daytime light exposure when we stay indoors all day. And that also means that we produce less melatonin at night. And secondly, and I will not go into details here, but there's quite some studies that have shown that if we have insufficient daytime light exposure, we become more and more sensitive to the sleep disruptive effects and the circadian phase shifting effects of evening and nighttime light exposures. So having too little daytime light makes us more vulnerable for the light at night. And insufficient daytime light will compromise sleep quality and also sleep timing and make the evening light more disruptive for sleep and also more strongly delaying our sleep patterns. Next slide, please. So here again, as I've said before, the natural light makes us more of a morning person, and the electrical light condition, next clip, please, makes us more of an evening person. And well, you might say, well, who cares? I mean, that's just a personal preference. But if you look at how we behave across a week and a weekend, these are typical examples how an individual would be. In dark, you see sleep on a weekday, and in green, you see the sleep on a weekend day. And if one is a morning person, there is not too much difference between the sleep timing in the weekends and the weekdays. You see that on the left-hand side, the person goes to bed just before midnight and typically gets up by the time that the melatonin levels have dropped in his body. And you see that in the weekends, people tend to sleep a bit later because the melatonin is still present in the body when we usually wake up. So the wake-up signal or the drive to go to sleep in the evening is a bit later in the weekends, and people tend to sleep later in the weekend. And this difference between weekday and weekend sleep is a kind of a social jet lag. And this social jet lag, next click, please. This social jet lag is small in a person with who has a morning preference. But if a person has a stronger evening preference, which you see on the right-hand side, you see that the sleep on the weekdays is much shorter because this person tends to go to bed late at night, but in the morning is facing the same alarm clock to wake up, to go to school or have social activities or go to work. And consequently, that melatonin offset in that person is much later. And this person will sleep in largely into the day in the weekend just to recover from the shorter sleep that person has on weekdays. And this person then has both shorter sleep during the weekdays, but it also has a more irregular sleep pattern and a long sleep catching up in the weekend. So every weekend, this person, you could say, is flying to eastward by 5 time zones, and again on Monday backwards by 5 time zones. And sorry, I say it's flying westwards 5 hours on Friday and flying back on Mondays eastwards. That's the way how I should explain it. So this person has a large social jet lag and strong circadian disruption, and this is known to compromise sleep. Mental health issues are more likely. Performance is compromised. There's a higher risk for cardiovascular mental illness. there is a higher BMI, and also immune function can be impaired by circadian disruptions. Next click, please. It's important to note that these circadian disruptions are also entailed in a transition, for instance, like we are going to have in daylight saving time, or from daylight saving time, which will happen in a few weeks from now. And I think many of us will realize that this really takes, I mean, this is not just a matter of just one day and then you're over it. It very easily takes a few days or even a week to get fully accustomed to a daylight saving time transition. Social jet lag, or jet lag, is a well-known circadian disruption, but also doing shift work, and especially rotating shift work, is known to be a strong driver of circadian disruption. Next click, please. So melatonin, as I've shown, is suppressed by light, and it's good to realize that both our melatonin levels are hugely varying across individuals. So there are people that are low secretors for melatonin, but others may naturally have much higher levels of melatonin secretion. And similarly, also the sensitivity to light, so how strongly this melatonin that we have is going to be suppressed by light, will differ largely across individuals. And this is a very extensive study that got published just a few years ago that shows how much light is suppressing how much melatonin. Next click, please. So this is showing how a 5-hour light exposure that starts in the early evening and then ends 1 hour after the habitual bedtime, how strongly that light exposure will be suppressing melatonin secretion. And the ED50 level of this group of 55 individuals, typically 50% melatonin suppression occurs at about 25 lux, which is 25 lux, mind you, on the eye. So that means horizontally, that typically means that one has double the amount in an indoor lighting, in most indoor lighting situations. This ED50 value has a high interindividual variability, which you can see here. Next click, please. In the blue curve, for people that have the highest sensitivity, they already have melatonin suppression, 50% melatonin suppression at just 6 lux of light falling onto their eyes. And the red curve, next click, please. That is people having the lowest sensitivity for light in terms of to suppress their melatonin, and they only achieve 50% melatonin suppression when they have 350 lux of light falling onto their eyes. And it's very likely that this person, for instance, if you are a farmer, you're more likely to be and have been outdoors all day long. In bright daylight, you're much more likely to be on the right-hand side of this plot. Whereas if you are an office worker, or if you're in a dementia care institute where there's very little daylight, you're much more likely to be on the left side of this curve. Next click, please. And it's important to realize that, well, light can suppress melatonin, but we have a natural gear in our eyes, or before our eyes. If we shut our eyes, this results in a very strong light reduction. And this attenuation by our eyelids of light is almost a factor of 200 for blue and green light. So only 0.5% of the blue-green light actually passes through the eyelids, whereas about 10% of the red light passes through the eyelids. But this red light is not too strongly acting on these circadian responses, or not a very strong driver of the circadian responses to light. Next click, please. So the human eye, and to understand how this works, I want to explain a bit more details on the retinal photoreceptors within the human eye. There are 5 retinal photoreceptors that you can see here. Next click, please. The rods, yeah, there they are. They enable for night vision. Then there are the cones, which are driving, they're peaking, have a peak sensitivity in red, green, and blue. So they're known as the L, the M, and the S cone. And then there is melanopsin-based photoreception within the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. This is a photoreceptor that has been discovered early this century, and it's known to strongly drive light's non-visual responses. And you can, if you are interested in more details, you can look up these references that are shown in the bottom right corner. Next click, please. If you look at the spectral sensitivities for these different photoreceptors, so as a function of wavelength, they are shown in the CIE international standards, where you see for scotopic vision, which is the rods, this is the peak sensitivity. For the L cone, seeing the red. For the M cone, the green, and the S cone. And then for melanopsin, yeah, that's the strongest driver of the non-visual effects. And it's important, these 3 dots that are plotted there below, which, well, okay, they're plotted now below. These 3 dots, they indicate that melanopsin, these IPIGCs, they have an intrinsic photosensitivity due to their photopigment melanopsin, which is blue light sensitive, as you can see here. But these IPIGCs, they also receive inputs from the cones, and even the rods can provide input to these IPIGCs. Although their input in most circumstances is not very strongly driving these non-visual aspects, it can in some particular circumstances. So it's good to note that IPIGCs typically dominate many non-visual responses in the habitual human lighting environment, but in particular conditions, there can be other photoreceptors that via these IPIGCs still are driving non-visual responses. And then for comparison, the black curve here I wanted to show is the V-lambda curve. Next click, please. Yeah, that's the photopic vision. That's the sensitivity describing and defining the units lumen and lux. And what you can see here is that this is a composition roughly of the M and the L cone weighted together. That defines the V-lambda curve, which defines the lumen and the lux. Next click, please. And then how much light do we actually get? Well, we use lux to express that. And here you see that on a sunny day outdoors, there's 100,000 of lux, which is a lot. On a cloudy day outdoors, there's still 10,000 lux. If you go into the shade or in a very clouded day, there's typically a few thousand or 2,000 lux. If you're indoors near a window, you typically can have 2,000 lux still. If you're in an office standards prescribe 500 lux, but that is horizontal. So vertically, typically in most indoor environments, that means that it's roughly half, or if LED lighting is used, it may be even more directional, maybe only a third. So there's much less light indoors. If you go to homes, that includes also care homes and many care institutions, typically light levels are even lower in luminances and only in range between 200 or even as low as 50. A candle would produce typically about 1 lux, and this 1 to 50 lux is also the area where you have road lighting outdoors at night, and then moonlight is below 1 lux. And of course, if you want to do starlight gazing in a dark oasis, then you will need to be sensitive for very, very little light and very little obtrusive light from other sources. Next click, please. So how much light do we need? Well, that is a thing we don't really know very well, but we can give some guidance here. And there is, CIE has defined a position statement to give some guidance. First guidance on this, how to manipulate light for non-visual responses. We need brighter days, and then brighter days not only in lux, but also think of melanopsin activation. And this supports alertness, supports the circadian rhythm and a good night's sleep. And we should not be compromising visual comfort if we make the day bright. So dimmer nights, that's the second thing which is important. At night, we need to minimize melanopsin activation, and also do this in the evening, because this helps us to initiate sleep and to consolidate sleep. Next slide, next click. And as a summary, take home from this message, well, to reduce circadian disruption, we should use light wisely. That means dimmer nights and brighter days, and that is relevant for humans and the bioenvironment. And is circadian disruption, is electric light a symptom? Well, for humans, yes, definitely. Light is a symptom of circadian disruption. But we should be aware that it may not always be the root cause. In humans, it's light and lifestyle together that drives circadian disruption. And of course, if there would be no light, we wouldn't do any shift work, and we would go to sleep and be more asleep in the evening. But if we stick to that lifestyle without any light, there will still be circadian disruption. So I think it's important to realize that we should minimize our light use at night, but still it's wise to use light. If you're elderly going to a bathroom at night, it's better to switch on the light and fall up over a shift before reaching your bathroom. And of course, for the bioenvironment, which we will see later in the presentation of today, yes, light is a strong disruptor, especially for nocturnal species of their circadian rhythms, and can disrupt ecological systems. So we really should be minimizing the obtrusive light that we as humans produce for the bioenvironment. And with that, I'd like to hand back or pass on to Mario for the next presentation. Thanks for watching.
Thank you very much, Luke. And let me remind viewers to keep the questions coming in the chat. We are capturing all the questions and saving them for the end of the 4 presentations. So there are a lot of questions coming in for Luke, and we will be passing those on after the next 3 speakers. Thank you, Luke. And Mario, you ready to unmute your mic? I am ready to introduce Dr. Mario Mota, speaking on the human health effects of light at night.
Sure. Thank you, James. Why don't you go to my first slide? So why, a lot of people have asked why the AMA, the American Medical Association, would be interested in street lighting. The reason is because multiple studies have now shown that light at night, as shown by Luke just recently in his presentation, light at night can suppress melatonin. Suppression of melatonin can have adverse medical effects on human physiology. This was initially stated years ago by Richard Stevens, far back as 1987. Since then, multiple studies have shown that. So the AMA, seeing that LED lighting was going to be replacing existing lighting across the country, looked at that and said the lighting industry simply was not paying attention to the health effects. And that's why the Council on Science Public Health came up with several advisories as to the best lighting to protect human health. So the AMA clearly said LED is a good thing to do. We want to cut down pollution and cut down energy use, but it should be the proper lighting. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that we noticed is that, and this goes back to 2009 with the first AMA report, is that glare and disability glare is a real problem. This has been shown by multiple studies through the years. The problem with LEDs is they're intense small point sources, and when they focus at the back of your retina, it becomes disabling and uncomfortable. Think of some of these basically cars that have high blue LEDs that come at you. You want to avert your eyes because it's very discomforting. Those type of LEDs, meaning 4,000 and 5,000 color CCD color temperature LEDs on street poles, can be disabling and actually be road hazards. So we really should aim for eliminating the blue to avoid that problem. Next slide. The human eye is a marvelous development and very intricate. So here is a indication of the lens of the human eye under the cornea. It has a design flaw, unfortunately. It has no blood cells that enter. There are no blood cells that enter the lens part. That's the cornea you're pointing at. And again, no blood cells there. Consequently, the lens grows through the years as we age with more and more layers on the outside. It gets all its nutrients by diffusion from the liquid around it called the aqueous humor. The problem is once you approach age 40 or 50, the center becomes so distant from the surface that it does not get a good level of oxygenation. Consequently, by age 50, some cells start to die and then they calcify. This leads to a lot of microcalcifications. Eventually, it'll fuse and form a cataract. The problem is these microcalcifications, even when you don't realize your eye's being affected, scatter light. And by scattering light, that's what causes disability glare. And blue scatters more, which is why blue light causes more disability glare. Next slide. So if you look on the left, this goes back many years, and it's well known that the older you are, the less light it takes to cause disability glare. When you're young and invincible, it takes a lot of light to cause disability glare because your lens is clear. As you approach age 60, it takes only 1/3 as much light to cause disability glare. A lot of seniors around the world think it's their fault because their eyes are bad, quote, when they go out and drive at night that they have a hard time seeing. No, it's because of bad engineering and poor design of streetlights. If streetlights were properly shielded and eliminated blue and you wouldn't get as much scatter, you'd be able to drive a lot better. On the right side of that slide, this came from the Netherlands by Van den Berg as far back as 1999, where he took human eyes and actually measured the amount of scatter. This is a log, so it's actually much more of a change between the blue and the red. But just as the sun turns red because blue scatters at sunset, in a human eye, the blue scatters a lot more, and that causes disability glare. Consequently, at night, if you have lots of blue coming from street lamps, you don't drive as well, you don't see as well, and in effect, these lights become road hazards. We should go for warmer lighting for better driving. Next slide. This comes from the IES directly. Alan Lewis is a former president of the IES, and he actually sent me the left and middle panel from his own research that's been published. And as you can see, the IES keeps saying they need 4,000, 5,000 LED for better visibility down the road. If you look at that, the difference between 2,700 and 6,000 K LED is minimal. You're talking about just a few feet. The only time it makes a difference is if you're going on panel 14, 21 meters off the road. We're not driving 24 meters off the road. If you need lighting in that location, you can add an additional light. The point of the matter is there's not much difference between the different color temperature LEDs by their own data. The panel on the right is from Rob Gibbons from Virginia Tech, and he's a member of the IES. And his data actually shows high pressure sodium, which is 2200, is actually the best for looking down the road. And you actually have a detriment when you go to 6,000. Not much difference at 3,500. So that should put to rest the misconception that you need high K LED lights in order to see better down the road. Next slide. So now get on to specific health effects of melatonin suppression that Luke went over. The most important and best study is breast cancer. As far back as 1987, Richard Stevens proposed a hypothesis that light at night alters hormones and explains the difference in breast cancer rates between industrialized Western societies and non-industrialized societies, like at the time, China. China is a heavily polluted country, and yet it had a much lower rate of breast cancer. Immigrants from China to Western countries then rapidly developed Western ways of rates of breast cancer. The difference he proposed was the light itself. And with that, you can make some predictions. Namely, shift workers would have a higher risk because of circadian disruption. And sure enough, that's been shown by multiple studies now, so much so that the IARC from the UN declared shift working a stage 2, level 2 carcinogen, at the same level of risk, by the way, as smoking for lungs. Another prediction would be blind women would have a lower risk of breast cancer than non-blind women. The best study and multiple studies have shown that, but the best study was a large study that actually included twins, one sighted and one not. And now here you have two sisters growing up in the same environment, mental effects, and yet the non-sighted woman has a 15–20% lower risk of breast cancer than the sighted sister. It's purely the light in this case that makes the difference. Lighted bedrooms at night increase risk at night. We know that. We should shut off the lights and not leave night lights on. And long sleep lowers risk. Multiple studies have confirmed those hypotheses as well. Next slide. So the circadian clock in our brain, 10% of all mammalian genes are clock controlled. And knowing that, it should come as no surprise that if we affect the clock genes by abnormal light at night, you're going to have a significant biological effect. Multiple studies, again, have shown that. Next slide. So one of the best studies, you can't do research studies on humans, but you can do them on rats. The human studies are going to be epidemiologic. I'll show a few of those in a moment. The best study, the most elegant study I've ever seen is by David Blask from Tulane, as far back as 2003. What he did is he took nude mice, that's an experimental animal that accepts transplants, and he implanted human breast cancer cells into, I think it was 120 nude mice, and divided them into multiple cohorts. If you look at the open circle, 20 of these mice were kept along a normal day-night cycle, and that's the rate of growth of the breast cancer cells in these mice. With the addition of only 0.02 microwatts per centimeter squared, which is a very, very low level of light, the rate of breast cancer growth in this cohort of mice increased. And then if you see with each increasing cohort, you have, with just the addition of really minimal increase in the amount of light, the rate of growth of the breast cancer increased dramatically. And when you have constant light on, the rate of growth of the breast cancer in these mice literally exploded out of their chest. They grow so fast. A remarkable and elegant study that has also been reconfirmed by multiple other laboratories. Next slide. So what about humans? These are going to be epidemiologic studies, of course. So the best study that I like is the comprehensive longitudinal study that over 25 years followed 110,000 women in the nurses study. And these basically look for relationships of what would cause the increased rate of breast cancer, among other things, and found that the women's neighborhood with nighttime light level, as determined by satellite studies, was a strong risk factor for developing. The higher the amount of ambient light outside the home that sneaks into the bedroom at night, the higher amount of rate of breast cancer rise, up to 14% in the highest quintile. That was published in 2017. Next study. Yeah, thank you. This has been shown now with multiple other studies. Most recently in Spain, a very similar study showed a marked increase in breast and prostate cancer in men with those that are exposed to the most street light. Now, again, this is outdoor lighting shining in your bedroom, not indoor lighting. And that's been reproduced with multiple other studies from Israel, Connecticut, South Korea, and a number of other studies, all with basically the same conclusion: a 10 to 18%, depending on which study, increase in breast cancer rates, depending on how much outdoor light gets in your bedroom. There's one negative study from Canada recently published at the bottom in blue, and it's not clear why that one came out negative, still being examined, possibly because in Ottawa, Canada, there's a much higher rate because of their high light of summertime of blocking window shades, but that's still being looked at. Next slide.
Mario, just another 2 minutes.
Yep, should be. Next slide. Okay, so to answer the question I saw coming up, the pineal gland gets suppressed by the RPG, and that suppresses melatonin and wakes you up. Next slide. Okay, so here you see the difference between moonlight and what LED light can do, because I noticed someone asked that. If you have a 4,000 and 5,000 K LED, quite a bit of blue escapes from those LED lights. There's a huge spike, up to 30–40% of the light from these type of LEDs escape from these LEDs, and that is exactly where the maximum melatonin suppression occurs. If, on the other hand, we use 2700 K LED, that's markedly minimized. Next slide. So sleep research has shown that the longer sleep you have in darkness, the better you are in terms of health effects for a number of reasons. Next slide. Circadian disruption has now been shown for breast cancer with many, many studies. You'll look at our report at the end, many references there, but it also has been implicated in obesity, diabetes, and mood disorders and psychiatric disorders. It affects the human body. Next. So New York City put it up 4,000 K lights in Queens, and immediately there was an outcry. The Times reported three different, New York Times had three different reports about how much people hated these. And if you look at that window, that's what happens in cities. Yes, if you're out in a rural community, you don't have that problem, but in cities, light sneaks in. The lighting industry is responsible, put up dark shades. Well, the whole world should not have to put up dark shades due to poor engineering and poor lighting. They should put up proper lighting that's properly shielded and eliminate the blue so the vast majority of people can have a good night's sleep. Many cities that were early adopters of 4,000 K lighting, like Seattle, are actually taking them down now. So here's my last slide. And this shows some of the conclusions of the AMA reports. Why did the AMA do this? Because we care about human health. That's our mission in life. So in 2012, we put out a 35-page white paper as to the human health effects, much longer discussion of what I just talked about. Seeing that the lighting industry completely ignored that, in 2016, we were compelled to put out a report that says we should use 3,000 K or lower. Many people forget or lower. It should be as low blue as possible to protect human health and protect the environment. We never said don't put up LED lighting. We just say don't use blue, shield it properly, and put light only when you need it to protect human health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mario Mota. And you have a lot of questions rolling in on the chat that we are compiling and we'll sort through. And now let's turn over to Dr. Sibylle Schröer, who will give a brief presentation on the effects of artificial light at night on flora and fauna.
Yes, hello, good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here, and thank you earlier for the introduction. Yeah, next slide, please. Well, who uses the nighttime? It's about a third of the vertebrates and over 60% of invertebrates that use the night. We have bats with 100% of all species using the night. Non-flying mammals, so all the others, it's more than 60%. Amphibia use it more than 90%, and insects, half of the mass. So when you have ecosystems, they try to have a dispersal in room and time. So who's afraid of the night? Most of the mammals escaped the daytime predators, the dinosaurs, which were quite heavy predators, into the nighttime. And when human evolved, there were a lot of predators at night times, mainly mammals, which we were afraid of. So human evolved at daytime, where dinosaurs became harmless birds. So this is how the evolution makes night and daytime and crepuscular times as some niches where organisms find their spaces, and our nighttime fear might come from the predators and is an evolutionary fear. Next slide, please. So when you have a riparian area, you will have a nice distribution of life evolving from this. A lot of insects that evolve from the sediment, from the water into the air. You have vertebrates feeding on this. You have nice ecosystem that will have an even distribution. Next, please. When we turn on the light here, then you will find an uneven distribution. The light polarizes. There will be predators that can have better visual abilities, and you will have smaller species that will use the shades or stay in the shades and cannot go into the illuminated areas. You have attraction from it by insects towards the light, and you will have predators at the light. Some predators that can use the light, for example, fast-flying bats were seen to catch out insects from there, but a lot of other predators can't even use it because their senses have evolved to the nighttime and they get blinded by the light. Next slide, please. This is also true for migrating organisms. When you step out of an illuminated area into a dark area, for example, a campfire or a very lit area, you will have about 45 seconds or even less where your eyes need to adapt and where you feel a bit insecure. This time can be up to 45 minutes with amphibia. So when nocturnal animals have evolved their eyesights to very low light levels, they get blended much easier. And when we illuminate bridges, these waterways are migrational routes for fishes, for bats, for birds, insects, and these organisms can get blinded in illuminated areas, and they cannot go out of these illuminated areas because they get blinded or they do not perceive or can adapt to the dark areas, and they don't have the time to adapt with their eyesight because predators can be everywhere, and they spend a lot of time in these areas that are illuminated and cannot go on their migrational routes. So also the vertical migration can be suppressed by artificial light at night. We have here a study from Bolton et al. That showed at a harbor that was illuminated on the dock that the occurrence of small and medium-sized fishes was not normal to natural dark nights. So you have the black line here that shows that at nighttime, the small and medium fishes would occur under the dock, but when it was illuminated, this gray line shows that the occurrence of the fish was suppressed until the very morning, and no fishes could use this space. Next slide, please. Also with birds, you have here a model of birds, the gray lines showing the long distance migration routes of bird species, and the white lines showing the small distance migrational routes. Even the small distance ones show that they have very long distance routes, but all birds flying over highly polluted landscapes. So they risk colliding with illuminated buildings, and they get distracted from their routes, and they also get distracted when they land, because normally a freshwater body would be the darker area. When we illuminate riparian areas, then the towns at the shores will be lighter than the water. So the natural signal changes and birds risk to land in areas where they will not find any food. Next slide, please. We have a lot of effects also on ecological functions. I showed earlier that the fishes vertical migration was suppressed. This was also shown by Moore et al. In 2000, that even by sky glow, the zooplankton did not migrate into the upper layer column of the layers of the water. When this nighttime migration of a microorganism is suppressed, then less algae might be consumed and the water clarification can be suppressed. Next slide, please. Pollination. When street light is used in areas where insects fly, a high attraction of the insects appears. We call this vacuum cleaner effect. It was shown by Knopp et al. In the Alps, where they put on some street lights, that the pollination, the nighttime pollination of a thistle was reduced. So because this thistle became reduced, the food source for daytime pollinators became less. And this also had an effect on daytime pollinators. Next slide, please. Scavengers. On fields where there's a lot of insects attracted towards artificial light at night, you will find a lot of carcasses. We don't see them, but the scavengers do. And here I show one study that was done in our experimental field, where we switched on some lights, street lights, in 2012, and you can see the number of slugs on the illuminated field compared to the other field that was rising in only 3 years, up to 140 individuals on a very small experimental field. Next slide, please. One major ecological function of a lot of organisms is providing food. And studies show that this food sources change with artificial light at night. Vegetation can change if bats, for example, frugivore bats would avoid illuminated areas, and their seed dispersal was then showing less of vegetation in the illuminated area. Also, insects and predator relations change. Fast-flying bats that you can use illumination for their foraging, they tend to rather like moths as food source than beetles, maybe because of the chinidine around it, and so the moths seem to be nicer food source. And because they can select, there's also an impact on the insects, and this again has an impact on pollination. And we have also seen in our experimental field, you see the picture on the right side, that the very early communities of periphyton, so the first growth of plants in water, was altered by LED lighting with blue content, with 3000 Kelvin LED lighting. So the communities, some periphyton communities were reduced in their growth. Next slide, please.
And 4 minutes, Sibylla.
Okay. So we have heard a lot about the melatonin and the master clock of human. With all higher vertebrates, it's basically the same, and they cannot close the shutters. So nocturnal and daytime animals perceive light for their master clock. Their sleep-wake rhythm, activity and hormones, metabolism, blood pressure, and body temperature depends on this Zeitgeber of the light. So a blue morning light will wake us up, will give us the clock that we need. Next slide, please. Here, the study in Australia from Robert et al. Shows that a kangaroo variety that was observed on a marine base and outside in bushland. They wore collars for photometer measurements. So in the first rows, you see that the kangaroos that were in the bushland, they experienced a lunar cycle of lighter nights. With the marine base, which was fenced, so these animals couldn't go out, but they were still living as wild animals. This lunar cycle was suppressed by artificial light at night. They experienced about 20 lux at nighttime, although they were free and they would not always walk on the street. And you can see that the melatonin was suppressed highly for these organisms living in the marine base, and also the timing of the birth was delayed. So when the strictly seasonal births would appear from January to March, maybe April, the ones that experience artificial light at night would give their time of birth would come later. Next slide, please. And this is seen in many organisms. With mammals, with fishes, they have reduced luteinizing hormone expression. In birds, the seasonality of songbirds can be earlier, and mold progression can be irregular, only with 0.3 lux of light in the laboratory. Insects show reduced pheromone quality and quantity when under street lights. And also with plants, it was observed that they had earlier bud burst that was unrelated to temperature. And the immune response is also something that is depending on the circadian rhythm. And it is shown that mammals are impacted, and we have seen a lot of these studies earlier in the two talks, but also birds showed higher probability of malaria infection when exposed to artificial light at night, and an increased bactericidal activity. And in plants, we love to illuminate plants or trees. There is the accumulation of superoxide radicals and triggered stress responses. So when illuminating trees, we do stress the organisms inside and the tree by themselves. Next slide, please. So the effects are manifold. The habitat use and migration are affected, ecological functions, reproduction, and immune response. So Alan is a high risk for biodiversity. Next slide. But in environmental protection efforts, this is not considered at all. The protection of habitat is spatially limited, but there is no assessment for lighting systems that need approval for Alan installations. Most provisions require either a significant increase in killing risk or a decline of a local population. This is hard to find out if there's really something on population level declining because of artificial light at night. And Alan shows in the studies that the fitness of organisms and ecosystem is reduced, but it does not trigger direct mortality. Species and landscapes without special protection status are in most cases not protected by our environmental regulations. And this is also a problem with Alan, because most species that are harmed are normal species with no protection level, except for bats or amphibia, for example. But we need to also save normal species with no protection status and normal landscapes. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we have numerous studies indicating Alan as a major biodiversity risk, but our environmental protection regulations do not consider Alan sufficiently. The existing regulations cannot cover the various effects of Alan. And we definitely need more awareness. In the intergovernmental report on biodiversity, I have not found a single word about artificial light at night. And I highly recommend to increase the awareness. And with this, I want to thank you that we have the opportunity here to raise the awareness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sibylle Schur. And your presentation has also prompted numerous questions that are coming up in the chat, and that we will be passing on to you very shortly. Thank you very, very much. Now we'll pass the mic on to our fourth and final speaker, Dr. Annika Jägerbrandt from Sweden, who will discuss, perhaps with the help of our co-chair Kostas Barousis, our thoughts from our working group about protecting humans and ecosystems from anthropogenic light at night. Annika, you have the floor, and you want to test your mic?
Yes.
You're
Can
good.
you hear me? Yeah.
You're good. Yes.
Sorry about the light. It's getting dark. So yeah. Okay. So Kostis, can you or James switch? Yeah. Thank you. So these are the general recommendations from the group. And I just want to say that these are perhaps a first draft. At least I think they are. We will develop them further. So, so the first basic ground was that the general recommendation should enable regulations for environmentally friendly lighting for countries, regions, municipalities, and communities. And we are also aware of the implementation of the lighting scheme, the right light at the right place at the right amount for the right duration, because currently this is not always the case. And the recommendation should also cover most of the environmental aspects of obtrusive light. Please switch. Yes, so we have identified and prioritized aspect areas that targeting towards environmental friendly lighting. And these are not in any specific order. We just wanted to have numbers so it was easier to count the number of slides. And it's good to have a number so it's easier to go between them, I think. Maybe it will be decreased, I think, the number of aspects eventually. So first, okay, so maybe I don't go through them, but we will switch to the next slides, right? To save time, yeah, good. So first, the areas to be illuminated. We think that governing bodies should define a decision criteria whether or not an area must be illuminated or is allowed to be illuminated. And then also specify illumination classes and so on. The master planning should include strategies for maintaining dark areas dark. And this is it to keep a cap on further light pollution, and also to reduce lighting in currently over-illuminated areas. We also think that the zoning system for urban and environmental areas can be used with the specific regulations that are in the CIA report 150. And also the areas to be illuminated. For those, we need to have some kind of monitoring activity where we use commonly agreed and scientifically correct criteria and metrics. Next. So we need a definition of alien-free areas and ecosystems so it's easier to work with them. And so it's a little bit different from what you presented yesterday, I think, because this is more a general alien-free area system. So those areas can be environmental sensitive areas, wilderness areas, ecosystems, but also other relevant areas that should be characterized as alien-free zones. And this could also even be in cities where you want to keep an area dark. And also here, the zoning system defined by CIA 150 can be adopted for these areas initially. And in those alien-free zones, further development of the outdoor lighting should be prohibited or restricted by national legislation. Next. So the illumination levels for outdoor areas is always something people like to discuss a lot, I think. So the general recommendations in this case are that for all areas, the appropriate lighting class should be selected according to the relevant guidelines or standards that we currently have. We are aware that some needs updating. Yes. And over-illumination should always be avoided because you have this need for light, but you shouldn't use more because it's a waste of energy and so on. And the maintained average illumination levels shall not exceed the targeted value. And in the pictures, you can see different kinds of luminance levels in roads. Okay, next. So for the lighting control and adaptive lighting, we have quite a lot of specific recommendations in practice to deliver the right amount of light for the right amount of time. New and renovated installations should incorporate control of luminous flux. And also, if it's possible to implement lighting control system, you should of course do that. You can use the controlling power to reduce light during curfew hours. And you can also control spectral power distribution of the emitted light. The lighting should be reduced to absolute minimum level when no users are present. And they should of course be adapted to the traffic flow. Switching off should be recommended for areas that are not used that much during certain times, which are quite big places sometimes, like shopping centers and sports centers and industrial areas that maybe are only used some parts of the day. Okay, next. So regarding light distribution and orientation, we recommend that efficient and environmental conscious lighting design should be recommended. Yeah, so for that area, and you can go into this quite much, but some examples are to avoid spill light, to avoid waste of luminous flux, and so on. To make the optimal light distribution and orientation, the luminaires should be designed efficiently using good optics, lenses, and accessories. And light should only be distributed to the targeted area. So we don't want to have a lot of backlight from light sources that are outside. Like in the photo, you can see there is a lot of backlight because the road is in front of it, but the light is going into the tree instead. Yes, and appropriate lighting equipment should be used for each application. And temporary lighting should avoid causing negative environmental impact. This is I think it's often open for discussion because it's quite common you want to do some temporary installations. And in that case, I think you have to involve some ecologists to be sure what you are doing and how you're affecting ecological systems. And outdoor lighting should be designed in a way in a way to disturb ecosystems as little as possible. And then we have some examples. But that means that in special areas, for example, if you have a lot of water, you should try to minimize disturbance as much as possible, not to affect orientation polarization for aquatic species, because water will, spread the light. Yeah, thank you. Yes, so for the intrusive light, which is in this context defined as light entering indoor living areas, it should be minimized by using the following techniques. Efficient lighting design near residential buildings, and then we have some examples. And then adaptive control of lighting levels, minimization of facade lighting and colorful and dynamic lighting, and also to switch off during specific hours. And there is also a need to control the obtrusive light from distance light sources of high intensity by better applying proper lighting design and luminar shielding, and of course also control of the time they are on. So next, please. And for glare, it should be controlled and reduced according to recommendations for road lighting and for outdoor areas. And also relevant glare control should be applied for colorful and dynamic outdoor lighting. And in this case, you can see that if you see the slide that there is ongoing work within CIE. And yeah, so this is a issue. Okay, so next, yeah. So the spectral power distribution of the emitted light for rural and residential areas, we believe that they should be illuminated with sourcing having the minimum amount of blue as the minimum amount as possible, which means below 3000 Kelvin if we use color temperature, which is questioned. So I'm just, okay, so for tunable white luminaires with variable luminous flux could be used for residential and other urban areas when you need warm white light. And the white light, in this case 4000 Kelvin, but it could be other values as well. It should be some restriction in use for it, but we are aware that there are some technological difficulties to switch to 3000 or lower. So it should be allowed to use it in some cases. The environmental sensitive areas should be illuminated only with sources with minimal spectral content in blue. And there are some techniques for that in the market, I think. And so the next one. Yes, so the modulated light in color facades and illuminated signs are strongly discouraged. We need to reduce the luminous intensity in order to reduce glare and disturbance on species from those occasions. Illuminated facades and media advertisements should be switched off in specific hours. And also the modulation frequency should be minimized to avoid disturbance to humans and natural species. Okay, next one. Yes, so regarding light measurements, we recommend that obtrusive light and sky glow should be carefully assessed and monitored via measurements and monitoring and dedicated assessments for specific areas. But also verification of lighting installations should be done to avoid over-illumination or bad practice. Obtrusive light and sky glow measurements should be implemented in national or local regulations. And also mitigation and restoration measures should be applied when scientifically justified thresholds are exceeded. Yes, next. So we have identified some urgent research topics. First of all, it's important to work together. So among interdisciplinaries, lighting, medical and environmental research communities. So we want to encourage research on effects of ALAN on human health, on flora and fauna, on visibility levels and public safety. And also to identify thresholds for impacts of ALAN on humans and natural species. And measurement, monitoring and impact assessment of ecological effects of ALAN is needed. We also need studies on impact of new technologies, which include adaptive lighting and other characteristics of new light sources, such as light modulation and glare, which is typical for the new techniques. Also, studies should use the correct and appropriate light quantities and metrics, which unfortunately in many cases are not properly used. And if it is not, it's really difficult for people who work with lighting design to actually use the research, because you cannot translate some specific metrics to how you actually are using light sources when you plan it. Okay, so next. So there is a lot of strategic targets we have identified. We'll just read through it. So to establish specific regulations for outdoor lighting within each country is a strategic target. And to establish an accreditation system to ensure that new installation and renovations follow the relevant regulations. We think also that it's necessary to review and revise lighting legislation to consider environmental effects of ALAN. and also to review and update the current requirements for illuminating roads and highways. And maybe there are some other standards that needs updating as well. It's also important with the target to minimize the negative effect of outdoor lighting on human health and natural species. We need to restore and protect affected existing ecosystems by implementing environmentally conscious lighting technology. And another thing is to promote lighting education for the research communities that are new to studying the influence of light of humans and the biological system. So we use the same metrics so we can compare our results from the research. And also to develop a scale of ecological classes of dark skies. Yes, I think I didn't do it over time. I hope not. Yes. Yes, and yeah.
Beautiful job. Thank you very much for the excellent summary of our extensive and heavily researched recommendations. And we will now proceed to discussion for our 4 speakers and perhaps the rest of the working group members. And the questions have been compiled during this last hour plus. And we're now passing the mic over to working group member, Dr. Andy Yesho. And Andy will select questions for each of the 4 panelists.
Yes, so we got like heaps of questions, so don't don't be bothered if your question does not come up. We had like so many questions. Some have been already answered in a chat, but I will still ask some. So let's jump into like the first part of the talk. Luke, are you still around?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very clearly.
Yeah.
So there was some confusion about melatonin, probably because people were also just like jumping in as your talk progressed. So like maybe give in a very basic words, because it's such a central thing to the whole group here. Maybe give in a few basic words, what is it? What does it do? Very briefly. And does it have any other function than regulating wake and sleep cycles?
Yeah, I think we know a lot about it, but not all. But it's melatonin is a conserved marker in diurnal and nocturnal species for the night. And melatonin is the signal of our body that it's time to have nighttime behavior. And that applies to diurnal and nocturnal species. And therefore, I mean, I think melatonin physiologically is signaling the intrinsic circadian rhythm, the 24-hour rhythm that any life form needs to anticipate food availability, but also to be able to track changes in day length. And across seasons, for instance, adapt behavior in anticipation of mating season or migration patterns that are needed with seasons are all driven by photoperiod and the biological clock, and melatonin is the signal that drives all these processes. There are melatonin receptors throughout the body on quite some places that we don't yet fully understand, and I must say that I don't feel entitled to dive into details there too much. Melatonin as a whole.
Into details with this opening question. So
Okay.
I think people were amazed also by the relatively low levels when melatonin suppression is triggered and how fast it can go. And I think a follow-up question was, how do we detect light when we are sleeping? Like the eyes are closed, like how does it work? Again, very briefly.
Yeah, I think that if you're sleeping and your eyelids are closed, then there is hardly any light reaching the eyes, and especially if your pupil also is not oriented in the forward direction. So during REM sleep, the pupil is moving all around, and there may be some transmission through the eyelid. But I would say when you shut your eyes, there is hardly any light exposure on the retina that is influencing melatonin. It's good to know, though, that people will be suppressing their melatonin levels by just a candle if they would have lived all day long or weeks long in a total darkness. Then even a candle can be disrupted or entrain a circadian rhythm or suppress melatonin in those conditions.
So maybe I pass this question on to Mario. Mario,
Sure.
are you around?
I'll just comment on that briefly. Most studies show most people wake up in the middle of the night. Okay, if they're in darkness, the melatonin level stays elevated. If you have light leaking through your windows, it suppresses your melatonin, just like that the mice study that I showed earlier from Dr. Blask. It doesn't take much melatonin to suppress. I mean, it doesn't take much light leakage to suppress melatonin. Since most people wake up in the middle of the night, that's why you want to control the amount of light that spills into your bedrooms.
Can I add something? Is that allowed, or?
Yeah. At this point, maybe, yeah. If we
I want to make a short remark that the our human sleep pattern has sleep cycles. So we move from 90 minutes of deep sleep, and then we have a period where there is shallow sleep and people wake up more easily. And that's a natural thing. And I don't think waking up at that time of night is also a natural thing, which is generated by the sleep pattern within an individual, irrespective of the light conditions.
That is correct.
Yeah, I guess there were some questions regarding like melatonin suppression by street lights. Like I guess Luke and Mario will have different answers to that, but what is your answers? Luke, start, and Mario.
Yeah, I'm not, whether street light can suppress melatonin? Or what is it? I'm not sure whether I understand the question. Yeah, I would say it can, but I think if you are the farmer that have been outdoor on the fields and you that night have been are going to a city to have a beer and enjoy yourself in non-corona times, then I think in that case, I wouldn't be too worried about that light exposure. But if you have been living indoors all day, you should worry about that street light being suppressive for your melatonin levels. On the other hand, of course, you want to navigate safely and securely through the streets. So you may want some light, but the least possible.
Okay. Mario, you want to add something?
Sure. The study from Harvard, the nurses study that was referenced, broke the 110,000 women into 5 quintiles. Luke is correct. If you're out in the country, rural, it's not a problem because you don't have streetlights. But the vast majority of people in the world live in cities these days. And the quintile that lived in cities that have high streetlight penetration, those are the people that have higher rates of breast and prostate cancer. So it is a real problem and it should be controlled.
Yeah, I want to remark that it's important to not every association is proof of causation. As storages and birth, we all know they're associated, but they're not related. And that holds for many more things.
Well, the best studies you're going to get are all going to be epidemiologic. We can't do rat studies on humans. So when you have over 10 studies that show the exact same thing, I think you have to sit up and take notice. In medicine, we have a saying, first do no harm. The lighting industry should do the same thing, not do harm to the general population. There are enough studies to show that they should use low blue lighting.
Okay, so I don't want to have like a huge fight between the two of you, of course. So let's move to the next question. Is like a question from Michael. Is like, I live in a very rural area, no street lights of any kind. When the moon is full, my sleep is disrupted. Is it the brightness of the moon that is affecting my melatonin level? What do you think, Luke?
Sorry.
Who do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I want to remark that there are studies that even the moonlight by means of gravitation is affecting rhythmicity, and especially in bipolar patients, cycling bipolar patients, this is evidenced. So, I mean, the moon is a complex thing, and it's not only the light, but also the gravitational effects of the moon that may need to be considered for this.
Yeah, moonlight is only available a few nights of the month for the most part, and it is far less intense than streetlights. Moonlight, you're talking on average 0.1 lux. Streetlights are 20 to 40 lux. A huge difference in light intensity.
Yes, okay. Then there was a question from Steve. How does sporadic nighttime wakefulness For example, if you're a hobby astronomer and you do like observations at night, how does that affect your timings of melatonin?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Could you, sorry.
How does sporadic nighttime wakefulness, for example, if you are a hobby astronomer and going out like every new moon, so you stay awake for several nights, but you're not a night shift worker with this regular pattern, but sporadic.
Yeah. Well, in principle, if you do so by and while using minimal light at night, your sleep, well, of course, it's best to try to sleep as much as you can at night. But if you are awake at night, use the least possible light, not to disturb your circadian rhythms. That's the best advice one can give. But being awake at night, that's, I mean, there also was a question in the chat and I typed an answer to it. Whether you are awake or asleep at night does not influence your melatonin levels. So there are clear studies and real strong scientific evidence that it's really the biological clock signal that of melatonin that decide, and the strength of the biological clock that decides the amplitude of melatonin. It's not whether you are asleep or awake at a certain point of night is not influencing your melatonin unless you have light exposure at night. That will suppress your melatonin levels. The more brighter it is, and you could say the more enriched for this melanopsin activation, the stronger the effect of the light will be on your circadian rhythms. But it also applies that if you have been outdoors very little across the day and had little daytime light exposure, you will be much more sensitive to these disruptive effects of the nighttime light exposures.
Okay, so I guess the final question for now for Luke is like, is this sensitivity to melatonin suppression by light connected to the daytime exposure? Or is it fixed for each person, right? You answered that partly in the beginning, I guess.
Yeah, there is a huge interindividual variability, and we think that part of that variability can be explained by daytime light exposure, but not all. There will always be some people that are tremendously sensitive to light, even if they have been outdoors all day long, but that's a very, probably a small population only. But I think as a whole, I would say that this interindividual variability to light conditions, to sensitivity to light, is very wide across the population. And we should also realize that also melatonin levels, they are also varying across population. There can be people that are perfectly healthy with very little melatonin endogenously produced, and there are people that have 10 times as much melatonin, and therefore if they take oral melatonin, need a much higher dose than those individuals that by nature have a low melatonin peak, whereas they live in the same, you could live in the same light dark conditions. So I mean, there is a huge spread across population, but as a whole, yeah, you can say that people having more daytime light, having more light during the day, it's the light-dark contrast. I think I should summarize it that way. It's the contrast between your day and your night. That dark-bright contrast should be as high as possible. And you can look for it in both ways, dark nights and bright days.
Yeah, so people living in the cities will spend probably a lot of time indoors during the day. And they might also be exposed to like light leaking into their windows that they don't want, really, right? So this might be a problem. So
correct.
Okay,
yeah.
so
but of course, nighttime light is as well in suburban areas. That should be the least possible.
Yeah, I want to Mario talked a lot about health effects, and he began to talk about glare. And there was a question regarding safety. Like when you talked about glare, there was a question. Isn't it more important that drivers be alert when driving at night? So health versus safety when it comes to like glare and also maybe the color temperature of the headlights, Mario.
Well, yes, of course, it's important to be alert. However, when you have high intensity lights scattered by approximately 400 feet apart, you end up with a safety hazard because as you approach a bright light, your pupil constricts, then everything beyond that spot becomes dark and you don't actually see beyond the light pole unless there's uniformity of illumination. And then you go into the next dark spot and basically you don't see well. Then you hit the next bright light spot and your pupils constrict again. So poor spectral distribution, high blue, poor evenness of illumination are all part of it. But one thing we do know is high blue scatters in the human eye. And when it scatters, you have disability glare where you can't see very well. And the older you are, the bigger an effect that is. Most older people will say they can't drive at night because they think it's their eyes. No, it's bad engineering. I make that statement again.
Okay, there's like a follow-up question to that. And I suppose the answer is difficult. But Karen asked, like, given the science on disability glare seems so clear, why is it such a challenge to persuade local councils and other organizations to reduce blue light in street lighting?
Who's that for?
I guess that goes in the first place to you, and maybe Luke wants to comment on it.
Okay. Most city councils, because I've dealt with this over 25 years now, are only concerned about cost, then cost, then cost. So they don't care about astronomy. They don't care pretty much about anything we just discussed. However, having said that, one of the ways we, in my town, we got proper lighting. My town in Gloucester now has 3000 K lighting put in 10 years ago, well shielded, 19 watt. Okay, the way we convinced them was that LED lights are lower in cost. And what we did is to convince the city council, we had the local lighting companies put up 3000 K lighting, 3500 and 4000 K lighting on different streets. And we just had the city vote. Uniformly, everyone said that 3000 K lighting was better. Every city that has put up 4000 K lighting has had endless complaints. Many cities are demanding that they be taken down. Seattle just last year, Monterey, California, Davis, California. Once you have to live under these lights, you realize how awful they are and how disruptive they are. Most people strongly prefer 3000 K lights. And the cost between a 3000 K light, or nowadays a 2400 K light, and a 4000 K light is basically the same. And the operating costs in them are basically the same. The efficiencies are the same. So the cost argument really goes away.
Yeah,
Luke, you have a comment on that?
yeah, I placed the comment in the chat. I saw a question popping by, but I think it's good to realize that due to the spectral tuning possibilities of LED technology, that correlated color temperature no longer is a good quantifier or characteristics to identify or to describe lighting with. You can have the same color temperature with lots of blue or little blue, and still achieve the same color temperature. So I think we should be careful to stick to this characterization in just color temperature. And apart from this, one thing that I'd like to mention is that if we are running, people are active in traffic at night and they are driving home, I don't know whether I would prefer to be driving on a road where the lighting keeps me awake, or whether I'm driving on a road where the lighting allows me to fall asleep more rapidly at home. I think my wife, I myself may think I enter safely home, but my wife may tell me, no, I'd rather have the better light and then you sleep a little less because I want you to arrive safe homely without any traffic accident. So yeah, I think that is an argument that is also relevant in this question.
I think the question is more about like glare, right? Like, I mean, glare can be like a safety hazard as well. And the other thing we're talking about is like light spill into somebody's home, right? So right now, I think the engineering is pretty capable of like providing street lights that let you drive safely home in a wakeful state, right? And prevent light spilling into people's bedroom, and the drivers to be like sort of like blinded due to the glare. So they are, but I mean, it's very clear, I guess, to us, but it's also very complicated, and things are complicating more and more if like we don't want to have CCT here anymore, but then the city councils, they don't know what to do with the spectral power distribution and so on, right? So this is like a more complex, of course. And I guess like something that could fix this a little bit is like sort of like ambient light in the car that might then be like a little bit more on the blue side so that then the driver is more alert or like something like that? No?
No, I think we should park that discussion. I mean, I just wanted to flag that point, but it's a minor point. I agree fully that probably there is a much more safe.
I agree. Like let's move on. There is, I think, Mario, there are lots of questions regarding the cancer study that you mentioned, right? So I think you mentioned like a cancer study that uses data from the ISS, and there are lots of like technical questions. Maybe to sum it up, like people were concerned that like if you look at like light being like sort of like radiated towards the zenith, towards the sky, like how can that be easily linked to like exposures to certain groups of people?
Well, it has been. What the Spanish study, the nurses study, the one from South Korea, the different parts of the world, and they all show that high lit areas that have lots of unshielded lighting. That's why you can see them from space, because all these cities have unshielded lighting and it radiates up into space. So they use that as a surrogate marker for the amount of light that's going into bedrooms. I don't know any other way to do it, but they're all fairly consistent in that. I saw one question, which I probably should answer. Someone named Mabel asked about, what about breast cancer for women who already have it? That's been answered. It was a nice New England Journal study about a year and a half ago that showed if you have breast cancer and you're exposed to light at night, the amount of metastases that you have increases and the rate of growth increases, similar to what happened with those rats I spoke about earlier. So yes, even if you already have breast cancer, you have a greater rate of spread and a faster rate of growth.
Okay, so
by the way, and it also suppresses melatonin, works with tamoxifen, which is a common drug used to suppress breast cancer in metastases. And a New England Journal study, another one, showed that when you're exposed to light at night, it doesn't work as well. So there's we have endless studies that show light at night is bad for you.
I think there's one pressing question in this context, and that is like, how do you disentangle other environmental factors from these kind of studies, like air pollution or stuff like that? Right?
Sure. Then what I would advise people, I mean, this is a limited format. We're going to publish the references, download that study and look at the preamble and the how they correlated all that. They accounted for all of that, and none of that had an effect, and they it's been they're matched. This is real and it's from the light itself. Read the studies.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that is like a good transition to go to Sibylla's Q&A, because there was one question. In the studies of animals, are there less influences to take into account? Is it easier to disentangle the effects of light from other factors, thus better isolating the influence of light, than compared to human studies?
Well, as Mario has mentioned already, we cannot do the same to human that we do with laboratory tests on animals. So there had been a lot of laboratory tests on animals, especially on mice, but also on birds, so daytime animals. But there are also a whole lot of studies showing that in the wild, we have these effects too. And yes, we can, in these cases, pretty sure say it's only the artificial light, and we can take out most of the other factors because we have both laboratory and experimental field studies.
Okay, then there's a specific question about like insects, right? So if streetlights have an impact on insect populations, it must also have an impact on the food chain, right?
Yes, that's exactly what we are referring to. We have a strong decline of insects worldwide. We do not know how big the impact of artificial light at night is. We see that it is often ignored in many studies as a factor, but it definitely has an impact. And yes, the decline of insects has an impact on all ecosystems because it's a major source for food, for bats, for reptiles, for fishes, for mammals. Yes, and to save biodiversity, we need to start with plants, with insects, and periphyton in the water.
Yeah, okay. Maybe a follow-up question regarding the insects and then also turning into wildlife in general. So there have been warnings about the insect Armageddon and artificial light at night. Alan is also a part of the possible causes for that. So the question, however, is there evidence of insect and maybe other wildlife population recovering where light pollution controls have been put in place?
That's a good question. We have seen that there is some adaptation at places where there is a lot of illumination, for example, in towns with single populations. But now we have a lot of long-term studies that also show effects on population levels of artificial light at night, but the recovery in areas where we have better lighting, we need to make more studies about this. Actually, we have an increase of artificial light at night. So there are more studies about the effects on this than where we have parts where we turned off the light. But this is something which is really interesting, and we should go into this to show how fast areas could recover.
I think, Travis, are you there?
I'm here if you can hear me.
Yeah, do you want to answer about?
Oh, I was just going to add that there are, because of the long period that we've been dealing with sea turtle misorientation and disorientation by lights, there is evidence of recovery and use of beaches once mitigations are put in place to create more natural conditions. So in that instance, at least if we want a good example to point to people to show that mitigation works, it's on the sea turtle egg laying and juvenile orientation phenomenon.
Yeah, thanks, Travis.
Maybe I can add to this at the Ground Zero festival where they had the light beam, and this is a very famous study showing that the birds get attracted to this light. When this was turned off, the birds were immediately on their paths again. So also an example that it works to turn off the light.
And anybody who's ever put in a bug light as opposed to, and switch to a yellow light from a full spectrum light, will immediately see. Now, I don't know if anyone's done the studies on the population recovery, but you can very clearly see the impacts.
I think that is like one very nice feature about like light pollution is like that if you fix it and it doesn't seem to be an unsolvable problem, right? Like radioactive waste or something like that, right? That if you can switch it off, if you direct it to the place where you need it, when you need it, and so on, and be careful with the spectrum, that then the impacts of the environment can immediately have sort of like recovery to some extent, right? Speaking of the spectrum, there was a debate on the CCT already raised by Luke and others. Like, is the CCT? The CCT is not a good metric. Are there also like spectral measured with like environmental studies more and more? Sibylle, do you know of any of that?
Travis has done a nice work on this, showing different spectra of lamps. And I think what the ecological studies show, or there's another study by Donners et al., where they show the sensitivity of insects to light, and that this matches a lot with cool colors. And I think this is where we have to put a focus on, that there are sensitivities of light, but these are all lambda curves. So what a colleague of mine always said is, if there is only one light, organisms will react to this, and it doesn't matter what color this light has.
I think we're running out of time. Maybe one final question, Sibylle. Like the amber street light, is like now getting into focus more and more. Are there like studies that show that they are beneficial for the environment?
Well, the problem with only focusing on the color of the light, like I said, it is lambda curves of sensitivities, and we have different kinds of organisms that have different sensitivities. It is good to reduce the blue content, but we also have to blend the light to, or guide the light to where we need it on the street and not in the horizontal. So we need covering of the light, and we need to lower the intensity. In general, we use a lot of too high intensities on our streets. So even underlighting can be detrimental if, because of the less blue content of the light, the intensity is increased.
Yeah.
So if we have 3 parameters, guide the light to where you need it, lower the intensity, and use low blue content light, I think this is the best recommendation to work together.
Yeah, so we might have some questions like still left, like 2 minutes, I think. So there is like one question I found very interesting, which is like about light trespass. Like I have the right to sleep in my property without curtains so I can enjoy cool air during the winter months. Plus, it's an environmental injustice for some populations. We have low-income people that can't even afford a home and live on the streets. Like, anyone wants to comment on that?
I agree. I completely agree. The answer to this is proper engineering.
Yeah, proper engineering again, right? Like guide the light where it is needed, right? We talked a lot about spectrum, but we didn't talk so much about directionality, right? So this.
Sure. I mean, CCT is a poor measure. I completely agree.
Yes.
The reason the AMA used that is because that's what's in the lighting manuals. That's what the manufacturers use. I challenge the lighting industry to come up with a metric that everyone can agree to, and then we'll use that. But right now, it's a poor substitute. And as far as light spectrum, the lower the blue, the better. And we shouldn't be forcing people to buy bad lighting, bad curtains just to overcome bad engineering. This is a solvable problem. I say that the lighting companies that do the right thing will corner the market and become very rich. They should just go for it.
Okay, so
can I add some?
Do you have time for question or not?
Sorry,
James?
Yeah, 1 more minute. That's okay.
1 more minute is okay. So there's I think a question that we haven't really addressed yet. It's like when areas are dark, what are the security implications, especially in developing nations, right? People are always concerned that if there is no light, safety becomes a problem.
Let me head that straight on. Beautiful Chicago study a few years back. Chicago got this huge grant to light up all their alleyways, and they ran out of money 2/3 of the way through. And University of Chicago then went back and did a study as to where the crime was. Surprise, the crime shifted to wherever there was overlit areas and actually decreased in the underlit areas. So, and that's just one of many studies that show no correlation between more lighting and safety.
And maybe one final question. Should we switch back to older lamps? Should we get rid of the LEDs and go back to the gas lamps? Or
that's not good, no.
Yeah, so probably like we want the right LEDs, right? LEDs are like a great technology that is very flexible, that can be tailored in wavelengths and directionality and so on. So we don't want that. However, maybe we shouldn't switch to new LEDs when there are still functioning lights in them, also because of the sustainability thought that when you think of life cycle of a product and so on, right?
And I think for the market, not only biodiversity, but also technological diversity is important. So please keep the old lighting, at least the low pressure sodium lighting and the high pressure sodium lighting. For some applications, they might be better than LED. And what I see right now that they want to take off high pressure sodium lighting at some points, that's something where I say we need some diversity even on the market.
Just
Okay,
want
Connie,
to
do you
add
want to
last
take over or
comment.
Costas?
Andy, yes, just for existing lighting installation, in most cases, is what you call light pollutant. So you may find very difficultly some proper lighting design with all kind of luminaires. So even with low pressure sodium or high pressure sodium, and one thing is that you cannot find low pressure sodium anymore. It's very rare. So from my point of view, it's as we mentioned in the long targets, and the recommendation is to have a combination of good technology, proper lighting design, and full control on this light throughout the night. And then probably everybody would be happy, or at least more happy than today.
Thank you, Costas. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. And now I will close this session and turn it over to Connie for some closing remarks for today.
Well, we want to thank everybody for such an illuminating conversation. That was amazing. In closing, we would like to thank all of you for coming to the workshop and contributing to such great questions to discussion. The collective discussion brings new insight and will help the working group enrich the next version of the report. So thank you very much. Next slide, please. Speaking of reports, we have the 5 draft reports, 1 per focus area, that are available and open for comments until the 16th of October. And you can download them from the address you see here. And you can also, very importantly, feel free to comment further on the recommendations at that URL shown on the screen now. If you registered for today's workshop, then you should have received last week the links from an email for the 2 sources shown here. If you did not receive them, and even though you did register, please feel free to email the UNUSA email address shown here. Okay, and next slide. And thank you again. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, when the focus of the workshop will be on light pollution's impact on optical astronomy and their ground-based observatories. Thank you and stay safe.